Everybody. So lovely to see everybody here again. It's a gorgeous day, which of course makes a perfect setting for talking about today's topic, what next after Sandy. My name is Felicia Wong, and I am president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute. The Roosevelt Institute is an ideas and leadership organization based in Manhattan, and we're dedicated to using the power of people and ideas in the visionary spirit of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. We promote a New Deal for the 21st century, and we also support the Roosevelt Presidential Library in Hyde Park, which is having a rededication at the very end of this month, and I invite you all to the Hudson Valley to see the wonderful, wonderful new exhibits focused on the Roosevelt family. So before we get started with our next session, again, it's called After Sandy, What Can We Do About Climate Change? I would like to express our sincere gratitude to our lead sponsors, the Chubb Group and their cornerstone agent, Dayton, Ritz, and Osborne. I'd also especially like to thank Mickey Strauss, who's the chair of Guildhall, and who, as Ruth mentioned, could not be here today. And of course, my colleague, Ellen Chesler. Ellen is a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, and it is thanks to her leadership and vision that we have now partnered with Guildhall for, I think it's 4 consecutive years, to put on this ideas, oh, Ellen, right on cue. We've partnered with Guildhall for the last 4 years to put on this Ideas Festival here in the Hamptons. Ellen and Mickey have put so much into the Institute, and they believe in the concept and have unfailingly lent support and energy to the work. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce East Hampton's own Dava Sobel. Many of you know Dava. She's a renowned science writer and author of bestsellers Galileo's Daughter and Longitude. And she'll be conducting a conversation with 3 panelists from Columbia University's Earth Institute and the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. She'll be talking with Steve Cohen, Sabine Marx, and Adam Sobel. So, Dava, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be doing this because interviewing scientists about what they do is about my favorite thing in the world. So, as you heard, all of our expert guests are affiliated with the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Stephen Cohen, on my left, is the executive director, and Sabine Marx is the managing director of its Center for Research on Environmental Decisions. And Adam Sobel is a professor in the Department of Applied Physics and Applied Mathematics, and has actually taught a course this past semester about Hurricane Sandy. And Hurricane Sandy, as I hardly need tell you, alerted everyone to the fact that climate change is here with us. It is not something that's happening elsewhere or else when. It is now. And it's remarkable to me how difficult it has been to get that point across, and how many people, even now, continue to deny the evidence. And some of those people are the same people who denied the evidence that tobacco actually caused harmful health effects. So I think we still have a lot of work to do. And why don't we start with you, Adam, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about your course and what inspired it, how you bent the hurricane to your purpose.
Well, I don't know if I bent the hurricane or it bent me, but right. So I'm a atmospheric scientist. In the old days, we would have said meteorologist, but nowadays that gets us confused with TV weather forecasters, which I'm not. But I study, as an academic, the physics of climate and weather, timescales of days, individual storms out to climate change, anthropogenic climate change timescales, and natural variations in between. Hurricanes is one of my research areas. There aren't that many people studying hurricanes seriously in the New York City area immediately, and so what happened with Sandy is that even though I'm not a forecaster, I'm not the most expert necessarily on what happens with each individual storm as it comes, but of course I know something about it because it is my field to some extent. And because I'm there, I started getting media calls. Was really what happened the week before already, because it was in the forecast and it was very well forecast, days and days ahead of time. So I started getting media calls probably 5 days before landfall, started talking on TV and radio, and that continued for weeks after the storm. Much more media attention than I'd ever had in my life by orders of magnitude. And in those discussions, and the Earth Institute also organized several panels where we had groups like this talking about all the different dimensions. And in those discussions, they would range far beyond my own expertise, which is in the physics of climate and weather. So we'd get into discussions of not only is it related to climate change, which kind of is my field, but what should we do? Should we build seawalls? How should we prepare? How should we respond? All these different things. You get asked even if you don't really know anything about it, and you can either make up an answer, give your opinion, or avoid it. But it got me thinking about all the different dimensions of this disastrous event, and also talking with many of my colleagues, both at Columbia and other places, who have expertise in the different dimensions of it. And so it just seemed at some point like a good idea for a class, because I knew all these people, and I realized that I wouldn't have to do that much work except bring people in to give lectures. So that's what we did. We had a relatively small group of students. And I brought in guest speakers. I taught some of it myself, and we read some academic papers about meteorology, but we had a lot of different speakers. We had a coastal geologist who's working out here and studying what happened to Fire Island, which moved about 60 feet landward after Sandy because the sand got moved from one side to the other. We had the head of the New York FEMA office come in, Michael Byrne, who's a very important person in the recovery effort, response and recovery. We had people from the MTA, from many parts of Columbia. So it was just no particular order or rhyme or reason to it, whoever I could get, whenever I could get them, but a broad discussion about this storm. And so that's continuing here.
Yes, yeah, we're still doing that same kind of thing. And so Sabine, let me ask you, you have worked on projects all over the world, Vietnam, Chile, Africa. Are there specific anecdotes from your work with storms or climate challenges elsewhere that were similar to what happened here, that you could bring some lessons to bear?
Yeah, actually, maybe first I can give a little bit of a perspective where our work at my center is coming from, and that will then inform the answer to the question that you just posed. The Center for Research on Environmental Decisions looks at the gap between the information that is available and its use by society. And in particular, scientific information is increasingly sought, and people want to use the information for climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, disaster preparedness. And for the longest time, the idea existed that we just need more information. There's an information deficit, and if there's more information there, then people will finally be able to make decisions based on this information. At my center, we're looking at this problem from social and cognitive psychology and from an anthropological, cultural perspective, where in reality we know that people do not use the information as it was intended by the producers of a lot of the information. So we want to understand what the decision processes are, the cognitive processes in seeking and acquiring information and using this information. So we're looking at this more as a motivation deficit rather than an information deficit. And because we know that information seekers and decision makers are selective in their attention, selective in looking for information. For the most part, we're looking for information that confirms what we already believe. We call this a confirmation bias, and we all fall prey to that, even as scientists, if we're aware of it. And the information, even if we seek it and we find information and cognitively understand it, the use of it is often shaped by the context in which we learn about the information. Do we learn about it in a city council meeting? Do we learn about it in a classroom? Do we learn about it in a meeting at Guildhall? The social context within which we learn about it shapes our actions, our commitment to using the information, and the social context might actually generate a greater motivation than if I read about some climate change information online on a web alone at home. So all of these factors play a role in the decision-making process, and we're trying to use the insights from our study for better communication, to inform communication to inform scientific information, so that the information falls on more fertile ground, and provide decision tools and decision support to decision makers around the world. And as Dava said, we have projects all around the world. But not only are we geographically dispersed, we're also we varied in the sector or the topic that we study. We have a couple of water management projects, one in Burkina Faso and one in Brazil, and I was involved in another project in Chile. We also look at agriculture and food security, a huge issue affected by climate change. And but then in addition, we look at some public health related issues with regard to climate change and natural hazards and disaster preparedness, including hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, debris flow, etc. So it's a wide range of work. And I would love to have like this one generalizable result and we say, this has worked around the world, this is what we should apply. I think one of the most important messages is we need a very tailored approach, and that requires participatory processes, working with communities and learning as much as possible about the needs and the demands, so that can inform new research questions and we can provide information that's actually useful at the time scales at which people make decisions and within the decision authority within which people operate.
Thank you. And Steve, I like the way you think because I know you have a planetary perspective, and I've heard you say that we have to do a better job of managing resources on the Earth because we are living on the Earth. We have not gone to the other planets. So we need to think about sustainability issues here. And I would invite you to expound on that, please.
Well, the way that I sometimes think about it, and the way the Earth Institute is really designed to think about it, is that there's now a little bit more than 7 billion people on the planet. When I was growing up in the 1960s, there were about 3 billion people on the planet. So when I hear people say, well, you know, there's no real changes going on. Well, 7 billion people with the level of consumption and how much more of everything we are doing is having an impact on the planet. The problem is that you can't disentangle us from that. Everybody wants their iPhones and their iPads and their big screen TVs and judging by the road out here, their automobiles. And you can't take it away from them, and they don't want to lose it. So we like this stuff. And I don't see us giving it up without a political dislocation that would be far worse than the impacts we're seeing from environmental problems right now. And then you go to the developing world, and now because of the fact we have 5 billion cell phones on the planet, and many of them are smartphones, everybody can see what you have here. And so that's creating a political demand. And so what we have to do is figure out a way to produce what I call the high throughput economy that everybody benefits from without destroying the planet. And we are under incredible stress right now. The hurricane is a small indicator of that. In fact, climate change is just the first global problem we fully understand. Think about invasive species and other ecological issues and the state of the oceans and the fisheries and all sorts of environmental problems that we're struggling with. We need to learn more about them, and we need to learn how to manage them. I have a high level of confidence that we can do that, but part of the job involves people like the folks we have here, first to understand the science better, and then, of course, to convince the U.S. House of Representatives that, in fact, there are some real problems and that we can't just look away from it. So my own work and the Earth Institute's work is really designed to solve these problems. Now, they're not going to be solved. I mean, as a public policy person, I actually don't believe you solve problems. I think you make them less bad. And so our job is to try to make it less bad so that we can, in fact, go to the next place. In other words, get to the next generation. Robert Hallbrunner wrote a piece called What Has Posterity Done for Me, which was at the end of his inquiry into the human prospect. And he really posed the ethical question, what do we owe to our children and our grandchildren? And I think we owe them a planet. And I think we better start thinking about that in many, many more things that we do. I have a high level of confidence that if we could just focus on it, focus all this human ingenuity and brain power on these problems, we could actually do something about it.
Well, I hope you're right, but I'm not sanguine. I read last month, front page of the New York Times, that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has passed a benchmark that is really worrisome. Adam, maybe you want to talk about that, what it means, and why people aren't responding with action.
Right. So the benchmark is that the fraction of the air that is made up by carbon dioxide is reached 400 parts per million, which is it's still a small fraction of the air, but it's more than that has been in very, very long geologic time, since millions of years. So it's not, the number itself doesn't really mean anything. I think the New York Times called it an odometer moment. Yes. That's kind of true. I mean, whether it was 399 or 401 doesn't really matter, but it's a symbol of something very real, which is that we've now clearly perturbed the climate system quite far from where it would have been if humans hadn't been doing the things we've been doing, hadn't been burning fossil fuels, basically. That carbon is not going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, some of it goes into the oceans, but that's been happening all the time, and so it's not going to disappear. If we were to, the discussion about climate change involves both, we talk about both mitigation and adaptation. Adaptation means accepting it because it's happening. Mitigation means trying to stop it. 400 parts per million, it's just a number, but we really can't bring that number down in anybody's lifetime. Even if we were, the important thing to understand about global warming is that the carbon we put there, what's already there, that warming will be felt for a long time. So all we can do is reduce the rate at which we're increasing it and reduce the amount of warming. And so that's what makes it scary. I mean, it's a symbol that we're already kind of going over this cliff. We can only try to get there slower if we, at best. And within that, we're not doing either because of political economic difficulties that Steve was talking about. Right. So, 400 parts per million. It does mean something, even though it doesn't on the face of it. But it.
So, what would it take? And maybe Sabine, you can address this. What would it take? What will it take? The title of our panel is, "What can we do about climate change?" So, how can we get this idea across? How can we make people aware of it and willing to change their behavior?
Well, I think the 400 parts per million is still a very abstract concept, and it wasn't something that was put out there that everybody knew once we reach 400 parts per million, that is a major threshold or a tipping point, or it wasn't painted as like a scary thing. It happened and it was reported, and it went away. So if we, I think people...
I'm still nervous about it. I just want to be on record.
So I think, yes, for people who understand how the atmosphere works, this is meaningful. I think when if we bring in some analogies where people are maybe alarmed by a higher concentration of one substance, for instance, when it comes to everybody who gets their lab results after a doctor's appointment, there are thresholds, and if your certain vitamin levels are below or above, in that case below a certain level, it poses a danger, and you do something about it. And it might just be a fraction of a milligram, and people don't say, well, what does 1 milligram doesn't make a difference. But when we look at our lab reports, that these things are meaningful, and we know what to do, and we seek the advice of a professional whom we trust. With climate change, we don't seem to have established, first of all, that the analogy of an alarm that would go off, and possibly also not the trusted source who to go to find advice of what to do. But I think this analogy of finding something that is meaningful to people and tell them, look, in this case, you're not paralyzed. Or in this case, even though there are some uncertainties as to what this, for instance, blood alcohol level might mean for you, but you are taking action even in face of the uncertainty. You operate under the precautionary principle. And if we remind people that they operate on many levels in many different spheres of their life, they do take action under uncertainty. That might help them to say, yeah, maybe with climate change we also shouldn't wait until I think I have 100% certainty, until I understand it.
Do you want to pick this up a little more, Steve? You're very involved in policy.
Sure. I think there's a very simple answer to this problem, which is we have to get off of fossil fuels and use renewable energy. It's not a complicated, it's a technological question. It's a question that can be addressed through the use and application of new science and technology and new products. And I think people should be cautioned about not being too present-minded about this. So the biggest environmental problem we had in Lower Manhattan at the beginning of the 20th century was horse manure. We were knee-deep in it. Then the internal combustion engine came along. There goes the horse manure. Here comes some other problems like global climate change. So we have to develop a fossil fuel-free economy. There's no question about it. And we have to figure out how to overcome particularly the energy interests that are fighting the new knowledge and this new product line. Now, I think there's enough smart people on the planet right now that it will happen even with the political force of the energy industry. And what I'm waiting for is the next generation's Steve Jobs or Bill Gates sitting in some garage, and maybe the garage is in Beijing as opposed to Palo Alto or in California, and they're figuring out a way to build a very efficient solar cell and solar battery that you can put on your window and power your house. And when that happens, we're going to have a solution to the energy problem. The energy problem is the heart of the climate problem, and the energy problem needs to be addressed aggressively. It'd be nice if our government did something to make it happen. It's doing a few things. We're not waiting
for that to happen.
We can't wait for it. I mean, earlier this week, Mike Bloomberg and the New York city government put in place a plan to spend $20 billion because we don't think anything's going to happen in Washington, but we need to protect our city. But I do think that you need this technological breakthrough, and then it needs to be diffused throughout society. And the model I would use, in fact, would be the cell phone. I mean, today, every one of us has to carry these things around with us wherever we go, and if we don't have them, we somehow think it's like you don't have your keys or your wallet. 20 years ago, we didn't even know we needed these things, and now there's 5 billion of them. There's more than 5 billion on the planet. What brought that technology out into the world as quickly as it got brought out into the world is a good model to think about for renewable energy. I think government public policy has to play a role, particularly now we're in an interest group here. I run a research operation. I think the government should spend a lot more money on basic science and research and development.
Here.
And we should focus ourselves on this absolutely critical issue of renewable energy. It's a survival issue for the species.
Yes, it is. And if you had time to walk around East Hampton, you would see that an encouraging number of homes do have inefficient solar panels on the roofs. People are really trying. We're interested, and I think as we wait for exciting new technology to come forward, we need to know about more things that we can do as individuals. Is this?
Yes, actually, I almost wanted to interject when Steve was talking about the technological innovation that we need. And I know you don't believe in silver bullets, but I think we want to be careful not to present this as like there is going to be an engineering.
I do believe in that silver bullet, actually.
But the
inventor's going to do very well when there's a lot of incentive there.
But the uptake and the adoption of the next technological innovation, I mean, historically speaking, it has taken usually decades from an innovation to actually be adopted into practice. And you're using the example of the cell phone, which I think that was probably the most rapid adoption of a new technology. And in areas...
The laptop, the automobile, the refrigerator, the air conditioner, all of the, most of the economic growth in the 20th century came from new inventions. Unfortunately, most of them needed energy.
Right.
But everybody sees the true benefit of the cell phone, and it's marketed as a benefit, whereas renewable energy, it has such a stigma already associated with it, because it's either renewable energy or fossil fuels. And that this frame, I think, will prevent us from people adopting and embracing renewable energies, because we are dealing with a polarized society, and there's hardly any term or phrase with regard to climate change, fossil fuels, renewable energies that is neutral anymore. So I think that might be a problem.
Well, this is why, in a sense, the adaptation issue is getting so much currency. So everybody I know who lives in the suburbs who lost power after Sandy has bought a generator if they didn't already have one. And they don't like the generators because they're dirty and they use a lot of gasoline, and the gasoline might run out again. So if you told them, I could give you a power source for your home that was reliable and could work and might even be able to send energy back into the grid, you don't have to build that claim on climate change. The other thing is, if that energy source was less expensive than the fossil fuel, it would drive it out. One of the questions I always ask my students at the beginning of the semester, actually I stopped doing it this year, is how many of you have landlines in your dormitory? And nobody does anymore. They all rely exclusively on cell phones. And that's something that, it is an example of something that everybody saw the benefits of, but I think people would see the benefit of lower priced, reliable energy, and it wouldn't take a big argument to make it happen.
Adam, one of the things you do in your work is to construct models of the atmosphere, models of climate change. Is there, I'd just like you to talk a little bit about how you do that, how they are used, and if there's a way to move that into the public sphere so that people can get a sense of what is going on and be motivated to take action.
Right, so our understanding of how the atmosphere works nowadays is built on computer models. What we mean by a computer model is a piece of software that solves a bunch of mathematical equations that represent laws that govern how the atmosphere behaves, and we have them for the ocean too, and the whole system of the two of them, combined. And we've been doing this since about the 50s to predict the weather. The weather prediction is really one of the first things that digital computers were used for when they were invented, because the people, von Neumann in particular, who was one of the people who invented digital computers, realized that this was a good mathematical problem that would have some value. And so we've been doing these simulations. You can think of it like a giant video game. A video game is something, an imaginary world that has some rules and things happen, and this is the same, except that the rules are the ones that really govern the atmosphere, as well as we can represent them on the computer, which is always a little bit imperfect. So we've been doing that since the 50s for weather prediction. They've gotten better and better. A climate model is really the same thing, except that you have to get some more details right when you are running the model for a long time of many years, as you will have to do climate, because you have to get the averages just right and how much the clouds are absorbing the sun or reflecting it, and the tiny particles in the air and what they do. There are a lot of small things that don't matter for the weather, but accumulated over many years, they do matter. So these models have gotten sophisticated enough that it's not really accurate to say I build them, that no individual scientist, and certainly not in a university, can build these models anymore. You probably could 30 years ago, but now it requires a large team effort. It's mostly done at national laboratories. We use them, we collaborate with the people at those national laboratories, we go in and twiddle things around to do experiments we want to do, but these are the only experimental capability that we have in this field. It's important to understand that. We use the models for prediction because, obviously, I mean, we tell the model what's happening now and we run it forward in time, whether it be doing weather prediction for a few days' time or a prediction of what's going to happen 30 years from now because of carbon dioxide. The details of how to interpret those are somewhat different, but it's either way it's a prediction. But also, to understand the system, we have no laboratory other than the actual atmosphere itself, and the only experiment we're running on it is the uncontrolled one that we are running now. So the only way we can change something and see what happens is in the computer. So that's what the models are. They're very sophisticated. They're still flawed. They still have their imperfections, and you know, there are those in the climate denial community who like to pick on those, but really, if you have a chance to visualize, see a visualization, a movie of the output from one of these models that's built on basic mathematics and physics, and see how realistic the circulation looks, how little you have to tell the model to get it to produce amazingly, you know, images of clouds moving on the globe that look terrifically like satellite images, you know, movies you can see from satellite. They're really quite remarkable achievements of science and technology. And by the way, it's why our weather forecasts are, despite what some people think, have gotten steadily better for decades and decades and are tremendously better than what they were even a decade or two ago. And it's why Sandy was envisioned in our computer models a week ahead of time, and we were pretty certain about the forecast that we were going to have a bad storm in New York 3 or 4 days ahead of time, and that wasn't possible some decades ago. So how to get people to understand them, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe Sabine does. I mean, I think the images and movies are very helpful, and maybe we could do more of that. Finding the best way to image, to visualize global warming is a difficult challenge. I think, you know, what might do a lot of good to make people understand climate change would be a really good movie. But it's hard to make a really good movie because the story is inherently boring, because it takes decades for anything to happen, and that's why the only movies that there are like The Day After Tomorrow, where it's accelerated to ridiculous, unrealistic. Everything happens in 2 days, which is not possible. You know, so I don't know how to make the, you know, how to use the science to make the story somehow more real to people when it happens over long periods of time. But that's the challenge that we face. That's the communication challenge that we face, I think.
Well, I think you hit on a couple of things there. I also want to say I saw you in the NOVA program about Hurricane Sandy, which was so affecting and so disturbing. I was out here and didn't have power for a few weeks, so I wasn't watching television. And some of the footage was new to me. And maybe we need more scare tactics, more video game-like scare tactics to change the thinking. You said, Steve, that everyone you know who had a power failure bought a generator. Weren't there any people who discovered that it was kind of nice without all of that blinking and whirring, and when nobody called you, you could actually have a moment to think about something?
It would be nice if that was the reaction, but in
fact,
it
wasn't.
It's the opposite. People felt like they were going through withdrawal. I mean, especially teenagers. I mean, take a teenager off their Facebook and social network for 2 weeks, and they go out of their minds. I do think, I mean, so I think we're addicted to some of these things. It's interesting, is I have a home in Long Beach, New York, and in 1938 there was a very similar amount of flooding, except we didn't have, the house that I live in now out there, my summer house, didn't have drywall, it just had wood. And it didn't have very much electricity, and so they didn't have to do a gut renovation of the first floor as we've just done, because the flood came, it went out, and they went back into the shack, essentially. So our lifestyles are very different than they used to be, and that's part of what I'm saying. People really like those lifestyles. I'm not sure that mass awareness of climate change is not, in fact, proceeding. I think that a lot of people understand it. Young people, I think, have a sense not maybe as specific as you'd like it to be, but that somehow the planet they're getting isn't in the kind of shape that they'd heard about before. And, and I've been reading applications of students from China, and they're terrified about what is happening in their country. So I do think that there's a growing sense of awareness. I think what's missing here, frankly, is leadership, political leadership, especially in Washington, because we could do something to prevent this kind of catastrophe if we started working on it now.
Well, you mentioned your own home, and certainly everyone who lives out here or has a second home out here lives near the water. You might not have waterfront property, but you're not far wherever you are. And the sea level is rising. That is no longer something we can pretend is not happening. So what about these communities that get washed out? And the first thing you hear people say is, well, we'll rebuild. We're coming back, and is there a point when that becomes not such a good plan, considering where the money comes from to rebuild?
I guess I'd say two things. One is that there might come a point, if we have enough of these, where people will abandon. I think it would be a shame. I think these communities are wonderful places to be. I love the ocean. I'm sure many of the people here feel the same way. I think that we can build smarter and more resilient. New York City has 500 miles of coastline. Where are we going to move to? The Adirondacks? I mean, I don't see that as and most cities, first of all, half the population of the world now live in cities. Most of our cities are located by coasts, in part because of commercial reasons. And so we don't have a choice but to shore up our cities against these kinds of insults. But we have to start working on the basic causes. I mean, that's really what these folks are doing. We have 700 people in the Earth Institute working on this all the time. The Lamont Observatory has close to 100 doctoral level scientists working on this all the time. It would be nice if we could actually get the focused attention we need to see this as big a crisis as any humanity's ever faced.
Thank you. Sabine, I know you've done some work figuring out the relationship between people's anxiety about extreme weather events and their preparedness. Did you want to question the audience about that a little bit?
Yeah, actually, yeah. When we were preparing for this panel, one of our main communication principles is know your audience, and I was asking, what do we know about our audience, and how have they dealt with Sandy? Is this your second home? Are you a year-round resident? How long have you been here? What kind of losses are associated with your house? And how do you perceive the risk of this happening again? Knowing that will actually help us sharing more relevant information. So actually finding out a little more about...
Do you want to take a vote? Have a poll?
Or we could ask on a scale of 1 to 5, how worried are you about climate change? On of 1 to 5. 5 would be very worried, yes.
Okay.
And 1 would be not at all.
That's 5.
So we're 5.
Oh, the majority of the audience is very, very worried. So then the question would be, what are you doing about?
Well, the other question would be actually, how worried are you that you're going to be hit by something like Sandy again in the next 5 years?
Number 5, very, very worried. Confident that this will happen again.
Do we have people who would answer 1?
Are there any ones in the audience?
I think it's partly a function of how high you live.
Okay.
How high you are. And of course we have an audience that chose to attend this panel, so we can assume a fairly high level of concern about this issue.
So I mean, talking to an audience of concerned citizens is usually the easier one. But even then, worry alone doesn't necessarily mean that you will be taking actions. We have at our center done a variety of surveys, some virtual simulated hurricane surveys, but then also about 2,000 interviewees who participated in the last 4 hurricanes that came up the Atlantic coast. And what we found, like, people are actually, they're very worried about, in this case, the hurricane hitting them being affected, but the actions that people took did not correspond to their level of worry. And
Could you elaborate on that?
so people took some very easy actions, such as buying water, buying supplies, but the harder actions of buying shutters, making a hotel reservation, filling up your car, having some extra gasoline in a container, and being ready to take the much harder action and contacting someone, where can I stay with you? Those were the actions that people did not take, like a week or 4 days out prior to the hurricane. Then when the hurricane starts, when it starts to rain and you're starting to see the wind and the storm surge is coming, that's when people start to think, where do I get the shutters? How can I board up my house? And they didn't use the lead time that they could have used, because they think, well, what if I do it in vain and the hurricane doesn't really come, or it doesn't come to my house. It makes landfall farther south or farther north on the coast. So how can we bring the level of worry in accordance with the actions that people should take? And checklists can be very useful, but people get also numb to their checklists. How many people have like a checklist on their refrigerator, everything that you always want to do, or health-related checklists? People don't follow them after a while. What can be the reminders that people next year, they remember what they should have done, the things that they remember shortly after the hurricane? What have they learned? And can that be put in? Sometimes, policies help with that. There's an evacuation order, period. And if we see potential of storm surges at this level, this zone has to evacuate, and then it's not your decision. Other things that can help are defaults, setting defaults for people that make you, so you're not questioning your decision. It's a routine, you operate automatically, or for instance, the default would be to re-enroll in your flood insurance every year and not question it. The default, unless you tell the insurance company you're opting out, you're in for another year. That would be a default that would make this decision, it would take the decision process, it would make the decision process easier. You would still have a choice, but the default would be the more beneficial choice in the long run.
So I think that it's interesting to think about some of the psychological problems you raise become much bigger when we think on a larger scale. So we just had a huge hurricane here, so that raised everybody's consciousness quite a lot. And the problem is to get a degree of consciousness to people who haven't just experienced a huge disaster. And with global warming, this is really the problem, because we're asking people to envision something that isn't happening to them now. And this is very, very, very challenging. And so I think with Sandy, for example, if you compare it to Katrina, we had a very good government response in the short term. The failure is long term. The infrastructure wasn't built to handle this, even though we knew very well it was possible. A lot of the details about what happened in Sandy were kind of unusual meteorologically, but the idea that a major hurricane could hit us, Sandy wasn't really technically a major hurricane, but we could have one. We knew that. But we weren't prepared because the risk is low and it's long term, and all our time scales, political and economic, are short term for the most part. They asked, Max Mayfield was the director of the Hurricane Center during Katrina, who called the mayor on the phone in New Orleans and told him he had to evacuate, which they don't usually, the Hurricane Center director doesn't usually do that, but he knew it was a really bad situation. And they asked him sometime, I wish I could find this interview, but I heard this somewhere, and so maybe it's apocryphal, but I believe it sounds like a true quote. Somebody asked Max Mayfield afterward, when did you first start to get scared for New Orleans? He said 35 years ago, because this place was under, below sea level in a hurricane-prone belt. The risk was there. Everybody knew it. It was what would happen was, there were articles written describing pretty much the scenario decades earlier, but nobody took it seriously until it happened. I think the same thing is true here. We have this wonderful plan now that the Bloomberg administration put out, which, whether you like the details or not, is the most sophisticated and serious of its kind of anything I know of, certainly in the country, if not the world. Maybe Steve knows, but I don't think that has any competition. But it happens because we just had something happen here. So how can we learn to you know, when the science tells us quite clearly that there's a risk there, how can we respond to it when it's long-term and it hasn't just happened to us, so we're not all hyper-aware? I think that's a psychological challenge we have to deal with on a mass scale.
Yes, and now that we've identified how high the awareness is here, I think it would be only fair to let the audience voice some questions to the panel. There's no hesitation. Okay.
I am interested in how to get the message out and to heighten awareness to the real crisis point that you say we have, and which I feel myself. And I don't see any, although I have murmurings, you know, news of sharks moving up to eat newly arrived seals who found the Hamptons more comfortable, bugs moving up from the south that were never here, other types of species of other types of things dying out or coming in. Yet there's no it's not been drawn to a head for the public. So I was thinking that CNN or YouTube might be approachable by people with your weight in policy to form an alliance with Columbia and perhaps make a climate update program, a climate update spot, part of their regular coverage, be it weekly or whatever else. I mean, we have terrorism, but we also have climate terrorism now and food poisoning terrorism. But so if President Obama and CNN or NBC wants to bring news of that threat in a more organized, regular way, they might be inspired to do so by you.
We've been doing a lot of this. The Earth Institute spends about $2 million a year on our communications department, and we put out a lot of information. And Adam and Sabine and their colleagues are all over the media all the time. I think the issue of awareness here, it takes a long time, and the climate problem in particular is a very tricky one politically, especially in this country. We have a very geographic-based political system, single-member districts who represent a place. So the best problems for us to solve on the environment side are problems like toxic waste, where you can see them and smell them. They take place in a location. Climate's a problem that's caused everywhere, and its impact is in the future. So it's one of the most difficult problems to get people to think about. And when you have a Hurricane Sandy, it actually creates a teaching moment, as we like to think of it. And I think a lot of people have learned a lot more about the basics of climate change. Unfortunately, we're going to see more of these things, and there are going to be many more of these teaching moments. And I think, you know, one of the things that happened in New York, if you look at the polling, about 70% of people in New York State believed that Sandy was in some respects caused by climate change. When that questions like it were asked before Hurricane Sandy in this region, the number was less than half of that. So I think we are beginning to see people start to make those connections. And I think that there's going to be a higher and higher level of awareness. I mean, the mayor of New York, as Adam is saying, just $20 billion we're going to spend in New York City to deal with this particular issue. You know, that means we're doing that instead of building schools, instead of building a better subway system, a lot of other things that we'd like to have. So clearly it's becoming a priority in certain parts of the political system, particularly at the local level. My problem looking at this is nationally, internationally, we seem to have a lot of trouble getting things started.
Well, I appreciate what you said, and with all respect, I don't think either you didn't like what I said or you don't think it's a good idea.
No, I would love it. If somebody...
Think about an organized union by your university,
right,
some other entity, with a larger scale media,
okay,
to bring tidbits along of what's actually happening, and I think there must be much more than my awareness. Make it regular, make it part of what's happening in terms of worldwide terrorism, not to put it in those terms to them, and try to establish something like that. Because if people don't want it, we can't help a politician get it for us. So that kind of mass merchandising of climate, I believe, would help.
Did you want to make another comment?
Yeah, actually, I like the idea because it would be a continuous and consistent message. Everybody knows it's on Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. And you can view it anytime you want to if you can't make it at that time. And it would very often we think like what Adam said, like we need like maybe another movie, or how can we scare people? When you scare people in these one-time shots, it gets their attention in the short term, but we have something that we call a finite pool of worry, where the next day you learn that your spouse is being laid off and then you don't care about climate change anymore, or your kid failed in a big exam in school or doesn't get into Harvard. You don't care about climate change at that moment. So how can we keep a presence of climate change? And then not just climate change, and I like what you say, actually linking climate change to a lot of other areas in our lives, in our politics, because climate change will affect public health. It has an effect on national security, food security. There are so many issues that can be linked to climate change to keep the idea of climate change fresh. And I think that's what we need, to have like this variation of climate change that keeps resonating with people.
I just want to say, I think it's important to understand the problem, though. I mean, we do try to do a lot of things in the media, and I think we're going to see more of it, but just putting it out there doesn't mean anyone will pay attention to it. You have to get the eyeballs, and I think, and get people to pay attention to a message that isn't always, doesn't always sell itself. But what I think is important to understand, we scientists have often been told on this that we don't do a good enough job of communicating. Maybe it's true, but I think we also have to understand what we're up against, and David mentioned it at the beginning of the panel, is an active and very well-funded disinformation campaign. So it's not just that we're talking to people and they're not listening. There's a serious effort, which is really a well-funded pseudoscience effort with a big marketing budget that we're up against. So it's not, you can communicate all you want, but you have to, this is a kind of issue. It's not just a matter of
standards of proof.
This is the problem we have to face. It's not just
scientists have been reluctant to say, yes, this is happening because of climate change. And there is this other element, doing quote-unquote studies and having them published in respectable journals that are counterproductive and that spread doubt and make people feel that they don't have to worry. Is there another question?
You mentioned something about there should be a good film about this that will stir people. Well, there was An Inconvenient Truth, which was not only won an Academy Award, but certainly got me thinking. I can still see visions of New York City underwater, because they did a wonderful job, I think, of helping people visualize, what would happen. And in terms of action, I'm part of a small group that has recently formed right here locally in the East Hampton area, because one of our biggest problems during Sandy was a wake-up call, and we who live here we're very lucky because we were not hit direct, straight on the way other areas were, and although we lost our lights for about 4 or 5 days, etc., and we managed, but most of us, people I know anyway, believe that this was, it's not if it's going to happen again, and when it's going to happen again is more like it, and when it does, it may very well be worse than it was. So one of the things we learned from Sandy was that there was no vehicle in this town for communication. I mean, nobody knew. People were hanging out at the library all day with their small children because it had a generator and because they could at least stay warm. When the library closed, they didn't know what to do or where to go. So I'm part of a group that's recently started up to start doing some investigation about that, so that in the event of the next storm, where can people go? How does the word get out? We've got to get it out before the storm ever happens. Some of us found out about the Red Cross having a shelter at the high school just by word of mouth. We just happened to hear about it and went over to the high school to take a shower, But we need to do all of this in advance, have it well publicized so that in your, East Hampton is broken into 5 hamlets. So getting people from each hamlet involved, because they know their own community the best. how to deal with people who are homebound or on oxygen, or, this is what we're working on very diligently right now. It's not going to solve the problem, on a large scale, but on a small scale, I think Sandy woke us up to the fact that this is what the kind of things communities have to be doing.
Good for you. Another question?
Professor, you mentioned before various prediction models that you would run. Could you give us some insight as to, maybe it's an unfair question, best case, worst case as far as another catastrophe?
Right. In other words, you want to know what's the probability of an event like this in the future. And it's, I can say what the state of the science is on that. It's not based on just my work, but many others. It's first of all, nobody really quite asked this, but we've sort of been taking it for granted in the discussion, but I do get asked it a lot. The question is, was Sandy caused by climate change? The answer is it's actually not a good question, because no individual weather event is caused by climate change. We could have had a storm like this hundreds of years ago and probably did, and we know back to about a few hundred years before that we don't. The good question is, are events like this going to become more likely in the future? Because you can only really answer, science can only really answer about the averages. No one event can we ascribe a unique cause to, but when you talk about averages, you can ask whether it's becoming more or less probable in the future. The answer is, so there's two parts to that. One is about the storm itself. Are storms like that going to become more frequent or more intense? We know much more about that today than we did about 10 years ago. The research on this has improved a lot in recent years due to better computers, better models, and a lot of work by a lot of scientists. And it's a complicated, long-winded answer if you want to really, of the type that people don't like to hear from scientists, but we often give. But the short answer is, we think that on a global scale, there will probably be maybe not more hurricanes than in the future. There might even be fewer in the future than in the past, but that they'll be stronger. And so whether the chance of a strong one goes up depends on which wins. The fewer or the stronger. And we don't really know the answer to that yet. We certainly don't know it for individual places like here. If I had to pick one way or the other, I would say the risk is probably going up rather than down, but the science is still evolving on that. But if you ask about the risk of a flooding event like Sandy, and will that go up because of climate change, the answer is definitely yes, because of sea level rise. The sea level, the climate is definitely warming. So a couple of things we can give non-hedging answers about. One is the climate is definitely warming due to human emissions of greenhouse gases. The second is that's making the sea level rise, because the water in the ocean that's already there is expanding a little bit as it warms up, and then the bigger, scarier factor is we're starting to melt the ice in Greenland and Antarctica. Certainly Greenland and Antarctica, both of those places where most of the ice on land is. Sea ice, by the way, melting doesn't do anything to sea level because it's already floating in the water, so when it melts it doesn't change the sea level, but the land ice does. So the sea level's been rising over the last, and so if you start from a higher water, then the same storm, producing the same storm surge, will flood more if the infrastructure and where people live and all that hasn't changed. And so that, even if the storms don't change, the risk is going up. The sea level's rising over the last few decades at about 3 millimeters a year. 3 millimeters is like the white part of your fingernail. That's how much it's going up every year. It's going to accelerate. We don't know by how much. It depends on how fast those giant ice sheets melt, which we still don't understand very well. But the best estimates now are in the range of a meter sea level rise by 21. So since the last 100 years, there's been about a foot of sea level rise in this area. About 2/3 of that is natural due to the land sinking back down. The land, because the glacial ice sheet that was over much of North America, northern United States and Canada, 12,000 years ago, pushed the land down and we were at the edge, so we bowed up, and now we're sinking back down and the ice sheet's gone. So that's about 2/3 of this foot sea level rise we've had. The rest is mostly climate change. So that's about a foot so far. So it wasn't a big player in Sandy yet, because it's not that much sea level rise and not that much of it was anthropogenic. But in 100 years, the best estimates are about a meter, which is 3 feet, a sea level rise. Could be 2, could be 5 or 6 feet in the worst case scenario that people are envisioning now. It's not out of the question. So that's a big number if you look at the amount of the coastline around here that's lower than that. And even if you're not lower than that, but you're a little bit above that, then it gets a few feet, the water gets a few feet closer to you. On a calm day, then it'll take less of the storm. So I can't, there are attempts to quantify exactly how much the risk will go up of a flood of any given magnitude. I can't quote you the numbers from the top of my head, but even if I could, they'd be quite uncertain because of a lot of different factors, things we don't understand about the storms, things we don't know about exactly how much the climate will warm. We know it's warming, we can put a range, but we can't say exactly where. And then the pattern of warming is important for the hurricanes as well. Not exactly how much the planet warms, but how much it warms here versus there will affect where the hurricanes go. So a long-winded, complicated answer, but the answer is the risk is going up of storm surge events, which is the real risk for this region of the world, and we should be definitely concerned about it. And what one of the previous questioners said about this area getting off easy is definitely true. Sandy was a very unusual storm in the track that it took. It took this left hook and came in at a sharp angle to the southern New Jersey, putting some of the worst winds and storm surge right in New York Harbor. And that track had never happened before. And that's what you have to do to hit New York badly. You want to come in at that angle because otherwise, if they come up inland, they'll get killed by being over land. Hurricanes don't like to be over land. Or they'll go out to sea. So usually they come straight up the coast, and Long Island, of course, is sitting right in the line of fire. And this is historically an area at much greater risk than the city is. So Sandy was unusual in that the East End was spared compared to the city, relatively speaking. 38 being the worst, the last really bad event out here. And of course, if you look at the images from 38 and think how much less developed it was back then, the damage from a storm like that today would really be something frightening, I think.
Who has the microphone?
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask a question about fossil fuel consumption. And this is not my area, so I'd like your expertise. But at the beginning of April, I heard a discussion about fracking that said that because of the new technological innovations in digging, the United States is likely to become energy independent before the end of the decade, if not sooner. And that because there are going to be reliable, low-cost energy supplies in states like New York, in states like Pennsylvania, manufacturing is expected to come from China and Bangladesh and South America and come back to the United States. First of all, is what I heard true? And if so, if we haven't been able to develop alternatives to fossil fuels when we thought we had to buy them and defend for them in the Middle East, how are we going to develop alternatives to fossil fuels if we have enough to jumpstart the U.S. economy as soon as this decade?
This is another example, by the way, of some of this disinformation. It's true that fracking is going to provide some additional lower cost energy in the United States, and natural gas is better than burning coal and oil for climate change. But it also has some other effects on local ecosystems that need to be thought about. Now, having low cost energy nearby could help on manufacturing, but labor is actually at least as important a factor as energy, as is capital and a variety of other factors. So the idea that somehow the world, that America is going to go back to the 1930s and be a manufacturing giant because of the presence of fracking is what fracking advocates would have you think, but it's not true. The advantage of natural gas, I would say, is as a transition fuel to a renewable energy base. It's better than some of the other things we're doing, but there's a lot of effort to oversell this right now, to see this as the great answer to all of our problems. And in fact, one of the things that all of these technologies, mountaintop removal, deep sea oil drilling, and fracking, these are indicators that it's getting harder to get this stuff out of the planet, and that the technology is advancing, and so we're able to do more of it. But what about the damage to our basic ecosystems that we need for other things like food and water? Because we not only need energy, we need food and water and air. We're biological creatures. These things are important to us. And this kind of technological development has to be thought of in a wider perspective. But there's a lot of money to be made through the use of this new technology. It's particularly poorly regulated by the federal government. There are exemptions in the environmental rules because of some stuff that happened during the George W. Bush era that hasn't been withdrawn yet. And it's a particularly scary technology if it's not put under better control.
Thank you.
The follow-up is, how do you encourage the development of renewables if there aren't other technologies for making us energy independent?
There are two ways. Right. There are two ways to make the transition. One is to raise the price of fossil fuels, and the other is to lower the price of renewables. You know, one of the things that technological innovation has done in some cases is made things that used to be very expensive a lot less expensive. And I think energy may be one of those kinds of things. I mean, look at computing power. When I was in graduate school, I used a computer that was the size of half of this room and had less computing power than my laptop has. There's been an enormous amount of government money and technological innovation in information technology. Why not do the same thing for renewable energy? And I think we could lower the price irrespective of what's happening with the fossil fuels.
Maybe in addition to that, I mean, I think pricing is very important, politics is very important here, but I also think we've talked a lot about uncertainties. With regard to switching to renewable energies, there's the interpersonal uncertainty. What will others do? What are other industries are going to do? What are other oil-producing companies are doing? And that's where coordination becomes so important, that the industry leaders meet and discuss openly what their plans are and maybe find a common ground. And we've seen very often if people sit in the same room together, it will generate some larger group goals, and which will then motivate and appeal to people's environmental goals. So nobody wants to be in the vanguard and then be the one who fails, who will be seen then as the fool in the eyes of their peers. But if everybody else does it and I didn't jump onto that wagon, then I'm the one who got left behind and I'll look like a fool. There's also the concept of the free rider. If everybody else does it, then I don't need to do anything because everybody else has taken care of the problem. And in order to get rid of these uncertainties, I think group discussion among relevant groups, business associations, communities, but also industry leaders, I think are absolutely necessary to overcome these uncertainties.
There's questions over here. How should we be able to evaluate the studies that you mentioned that the people who are putting out disinformation, are producing? How do we evaluate that?
One of the first things to do is to see who paid for it. The second thing is to look at what we call peer review. When Professor Sobel writes a paper, it goes to a journal, and an anonymous group of similar scientists to him review it for its quality and for the innovation in that piece. Science is built on those kinds of techniques that have been developed over a long period of time. So if a paper has not been peer reviewed, in the case of most of the work at the Earth Institute, most of it's paid for by the National Science Foundation or by NOAA or by NASA, other federal agencies. We don't have an axe to grind. What we're trying to do is simply understand the truth and to try to build the truth. And one of the other things that happens in science is that people disagree with each other. That's how you get to a sound result. One of the problems that we're seeing is politicians and other unscrupulous people are jumping on those disagreements, pretending that that means that all the science is bad. That's actually an indication of good science, that scientists are actually engaged in that kind of debate. So if you don't see debate, and if the funding source looks suspect to you, and there's no peer reviewed, it's not science, it's propaganda.
Yeah, I want to add a couple things to that. Of course, it's important to say that peer review doesn't mean something's right. Plenty of wrong papers get through peer review, but the way science works is that over many years, if something has to stand up to a lot of scrutiny and be redone in different ways, different times by different people, then eventually we know it's right. And that's when we say that there are a lot of things about the climate and the weather that we don't understand well and that are still disagreed about. The basic notion that human emissions of greenhouse gases are warming the planet, and about by how much, roughly, within some reasonable range. That has withstood a long, long, long battery of assaulting and testing, and there really is almost no credible scientist in this who actually works in this field who disagrees with that anymore. 20 years ago, a little bit of a different story, but by now, that's the case. So it's not, I mean, all the things Steve said are true. The peer review is important, who pays for it is important, but it's also this long, one tactic of the denial groups is to bring up a criticism that's been made many, many times and refuted many, many times, but to pretend not to have heard it. So I have a colleague in Australia who wrote an editorial in one of the newspapers down there about why some of the denialists down there, and they're one of the places with almost as bad a denialist group as we have here. Europe and other places have less of it, but Australia is more like us than it is like Europe. And they have, some of these people would request debates with climate scientists, public debates of an hour long in front of the media. And my colleague there wrote an editorial in one of the newspapers about why the climate scientists refused to do that. And he asked, imagine it's a jury trial for somebody who's being tried for a crime, and the trial takes weeks, and you have a jury that's sequestered and is hearing all the evidence, and people come in and present the evidence, and the lawyers argue back and forth, and this goes on for weeks and weeks, and in the end they're locked in a room for a while, and they have to come to a decision. And they do it. Then somebody doesn't like the decision, it's unpopular for whatever reason, bothers somebody personally, politically, or something else, and they say, I want to challenge, one of the members of the jury to a public debate, and it's going to be an hour long. Well, the people hearing that debate are not going to have heard the weeks and weeks and weeks of evidence building up to that the jury heard, and it's easy to raise some criticism that's been answered at great length, but the substance of that can't necessarily be delivered in 5 minutes, and that's really the situation that we're sometimes in. It's easy to raise an objection, and if you've never heard it before, it sounds like something that's meaningful, but there's a huge, there's been a huge amount of this going on for a long time, and what isn't it the sun, that has gotten stronger? Well, no, not really. I mean, what about, isn't climate warming on Mars? So how do we know that? What about, well, the climate changed a lot in the past for other reasons, so isn't it just going up? All these, there's some substance to all these things, but in the end of the day, they're all immaterial, and the science has really, really, really beaten all these kinks out of it by this point, so you have to be wary of superficial looking challenges, and on some level, like all issues in science and technology, it requires some trust in the system. I mean, it's the same thing with cigarettes, right? People get lung cancer, but people got lung cancer anyway. You didn't smoke. How do you know that it's really from smoking cigarettes? Well, it's a lot of tests and a lot of people, and no person can have done all that work themselves. You have to trust that the system of how science works, and there's no substitute for that. But at the end of the day, a lot of the challenge to climate science really goes hand in hand with the challenge to all science, and in fact all fact-based thinking that we have in our political culture nowadays, I'm afraid to say. Don't get me started, but there's a lot of issues where facts and reason are being challenged as a methodology, period.
Another question down here.
The question back on what can be done about this. There was allusion to the carbon tax as a way of raising tax on fossil fuels, but we know that's stuck in Congress, and it's, what steps can be taken to do that? The demonstrations against the XL pipeline might be a second one, but these things seem to be an uphill battle. Is there anything in particular that in addition to what's been mentioned already, on how to get over those things and how to really address this issue?
One of the things I guess I would say is that fortunately the United States is now part of a global community and a global economy. So the fact that we have a dysfunctional political system doesn't mean that Europe and Asia won't be working on these problems as well. And so this may be one of those times when Americans will be taking a back seat to other countries. I hope not, but that's one possibility. I think the other thing that I'm taking some solace in, frankly, is what I'm seeing at the local level. My students did a study of sustainability planning in 30 American cities over the past year, and it's amazing how much you're seeing done at the grassroots level as people are understanding these issues. And sometimes the change that we need has to come simultaneously from greater awareness at the top and also from the bottom. I mean, frankly, I'm very disappointed in President Obama because I think he understands the issue as well as any president other than the potential for President Gore, if he had actually gotten through Florida back then. There is an understanding of this issue, but they're stymied by the interest group in politics, in Congress, that aren't allowing things to happen. And so what we're going to have to count on is an incremental set of solutions. Now, fortunately, again, our political process tends to be incremental and remedial, moving away from problems gradually. And I think we're going to start seeing more and more of that. Carbon tax would be a good idea. Frankly, again, I think lots more money in research for science would be a real advantage. I don't know if people realize this, university-based scientists outside the federal government spend an enormous amount of time writing proposals to generate funding. Our scientists are really entrepreneurs half-time and half-time scientists as they hustle for money to keep their laboratories afloat. And that's really a waste of intellectual firepower, and it's really kind of a sad thing. So I'd like to see small things, a bigger budget for the National Science Foundation, more money spent on basic science and development, and really what Professor Sobel was saying, rebuilding our faith in facts and in reality. Reality seems to be getting challenged by our news media. And I mean, I always say that questioning climate science is like questioning gravity. I mean, are we doing that now too?
First of all, I'm a little disappointed here about, I thought this would be a more basic kind of discussion. We don't need advice about, advice about driving smaller cars. We like bigger cars, and I don't think this is a strategic way to approach things. Or advice about putting away some gasoline for a generator if there's a storm coming. This is common sense, and you don't need scientists to tell you about this. I also question even the large budgets that the Department of Energy gets and many national laboratories. And it results in very interesting, I've read the papers that result from this work, and I believe in science. I'm scientifically trained myself, but we all know, anybody who's thought about this at all knows that the population is going like this. It goes up vertically almost, and putting away some gasoline for a generator it's a joke. It's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. We've got a big problem here that's going to result in complete disaster, maybe the end of mankind. And so I don't know. I thought there would be some discussion perhaps about the fact that the strategies, how to make things palatable to people. Don't tell them to drive smaller cars. They're not going to drive smaller cars. If the cost of gasoline goes up high enough, maybe they'll drive smaller cars, but not because they're preached at. They've done some marvelous work in California, for example. The state government there is very progressive, and what they have done is develop a palatable way of changing the generation of electricity so that all of the power companies in California, by the year, I think it's 2030, have to be getting at least 30% of their power from renewable sources. Now, this is undoubtedly going to result in some increase in the cost of power. The power bills are going to go up, probably not too much, but it's a palatable way of doing this, and it's much more useful than writing papers on little details of the dynamics of this thing. I hope somebody would comment on this.
Let me say that you need all of these things. The little scientific discoveries, sometimes you can't predict how useful they'll be down the road. So let's put that aside for a moment. Now, the issue of population, demographers talk about something called a demographic transition. And what happens, if you look at Western Europe and you look at Japan and parts of the United States, if you took immigration out, we would be losing population. What happens is economic development results in population control. And the reason for it is one, I mean, I have two wonderful daughters who I love very much, but they're not an economic asset. They're an economic liability. Sociologists say that they're decorative. That's one of the terms that are used for children, as opposed to when my grandfather was in Russia and they had 12 children working the farm, they were an economic necessity as well as Social Security. So part of the problem with population growth in the world right now is the disequilibrium in economic development. When the parts of the world that are in dire poverty get developed, they're going to be like us, and you won't have the population increases that you're concerned about. Now, in terms of these innovative ideas, California and New York are both doing things on energy. We're also doing things on energy efficiency. You, for example, pay a tax on every kilowatt hour of energy you use that goes into a $500 million a year fund to make homes and businesses more energy efficient. California has been doing this for over a decade. Those kinds of policy innovations are out there, and I agree, people are not going to give up things that they want or they like. I think you're absolutely right, whether it's big cars or it's high-definition TVs or anything else. And so we have to figure out a way for people to be able to have the things they want without destroying the planet. It takes creativity, but it takes science. So those little papers, somewhere in those little papers, someone's going to figure out a way to make a cheaper form of battery that's going to allow us to keep our energy costs down. I don't know who's going to do it, but I'd like to pay for a lot of those efforts.
I want to say two things about that. First of all, there's no big important science without little scientific papers. It just doesn't work like that. You can't just say, let's only pay for the ones that are really big and meaningful and not all the rest of it. It's just, you can't predict in advance. So that, I mean, that's just it's a false dichotomy. About bigger cars versus smaller cars, the economic, I mean, the cultural and economic problem that we have, and the reason we don't have a price on carbon is that the harm that we cause to the planet when we burn fossil fuels is a cost, imposing a cost on all of us, but that cost doesn't go into anybody's accounting anywhere yet, or not many people. So, I mean, if we actually, you know, include that cost in our calculations of what it costs to do what, then we would have a price on carbon, and then the price of gasoline would go up, and some more people would drive smaller cars. You know, you can. That's just it's just a matter of how you do the economics. Preaching may not be effective, but economics will be eventually.
Not only the economics, but the accounting.
Yeah.
We have another question?
Yeah, I wanted to address something from a previous question. How do you find out who to believe when you read the negative stuff? I would draw people's attention to a website called Desmog Blog, where you can find almost everybody who is a professional denier listed, and then with links to how to disprove the things they're saying. A second thing would be a book called The Climate Cover-Up, which explains in detail how the fossil fuel industry has had a strategy that's in writing in their papers that says we don't have to disprove climate science. Our job is to create doubt. And if there's doubt and people say, well, it's not sure and the science isn't clear yet, then nothing will be done, and we can continue to be the most profitable companies in the universe, in the history of the universe. So there's plenty of documentation online. That and the Climate Reality Project will also, it has specific, this is the myth and this is the answer to the myth. So that's another place to find things so that you'll be armed to convince your friends of the problem, the size of the problem. And I would also add that if people here are interested in getting involved in trying to do things, we have a group called East End Climate Action Now, ecan.org. We meet about every 2 weeks, trying to figure out how to get East Hampton move steps closer each week, each month, each year toward being net zero town.
So do you have specific suggestions for residents about things they can do?
Yes, for
on their
example,
own?
right now we're trying to do get organized to do a joint thing with the town where we help publicize the things that LIPA has already. There are many, many things that the government will basically just come to your house and give you money to not use fossil fuels. They will do a free assessment of your house. It doesn't cost you a thing, and then they will tell you how much it will cost to make these changes and how much energy savings that will result in, And there are even programs where NYSERDA, New York, I forget what the initials stand for.
Energy Research and Development Authority.
They will pay for it up front, so it's just paid for by the savings in your utility bill. So there are lots of things that are available. Renewable Energy Long Island is a great source of information of how you can, and we think that as each individual person learns about it and does something himself and tells his friends, it's going to become like the social stigma of driving an SUV if you don't do something. And so that's our idea, that you come from the bottom up, grassroots, as you were saying. And look up our website, ECAN, East End Climate Action Now, and come join us, and we'll try to help each other.
Sounds great. Are there any other questions?
We actually, it is now 3 o'clock.
Okay, so I would just like to say one of the points that was made in the discussion is that when people come together and talk about issues, they learn things, they have an opportunity to ask questions, and all of this is good. So we are really glad that you came today. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our panel.
I also want to thank the panel. Dava, wonderful. It was just lovely of you to do this for us. Steve, Adam, Sabine, thank you very, very much.